Thank you, Kristen, and thank you all for having me out here in San Ramon. Some of you know that I actually did an abbreviated version of this talk earlier today to the San Ramon Museum folks on Zoom. You're getting the slightly expanded version though, but I need to preface this with, I'm going to give a brief overview of the history that inspired each of my 4 novels. I do a 2-hour-long lecture on each one for Las Medanas Community College. So that tells you how much more in-depth some of the history is that connects all this together. So you're going to get a little taste if you're inspired by it. I'll talk about the books afterward, and then I'll share if you were interested in the lecture series later on. It's not till March anyway, and it's on Zoom so anybody can join. So in the Shadow of Diablo, Historical Mysteries of Contra Costa County, my background is in education. So I've been a public educator for almost 40 years. I started as a high school science teacher. I then went into administration, assistant principal. I worked for district offices, and for the last 10 years, I worked for the Contra Costa County Office of Education. And I worked with high schools all over the county. And that was about until a year ago when I retired. Yay. Retired life. I grew up in Richmond. For the last 32 years, I've lived out in Brentwood. Up until a month and a half ago when I moved to Sacramento. So it was drizzle raining in Sacramento when I left, and it's all very nice out here in San Ramon right now, so I was very glad. How nice. So let's get started. So all of this started with me and a bucket list item. And my bucket list item was to see if I could write a book. I was a science teacher. I was not an English teacher. I was not a history teacher. I just wanted to see if I could do it. No idea what I was going to write about, no idea how to write a book, any of that. I ended up going to a fundraiser with my wife. My wife used to be the director of John Marsh Medical Center out in Brentwood. We went to a fundraiser, and the fundraiser was in front of a house in Brentwood. And they were raising money to try to restore this place. So to give you a sense of where we're talking, here's Contra Costa County, there's Contra Costa County, and that red star is where we're talking about. East Contra Costa County, out by Brentwood. The house that we were in front of was this place. This is the John Marsh stone house. So that's a 7,000 square foot stone mansion built in 1856. That's a 65-foot tall tower with a crenulated top for gunmen, because he's living out in the middle of the wilderness. So going to this place and learning about this house was super interesting, because I had been living in Brentwood for 10 years before that. Never saw it, never knew anything about John Marsh. Total mystery. So it was really fascinating. I decided to delve into his history. Visited the East Contra Costa Historical Society, the Contra Costa County Historical Society, looking up records of John Marsh. Now when you find the records of John Marsh and his history, he's a super interesting guy. I don't have nearly the time to go into all of his backstory. I'll touch on a little bit. Born in 1799, back east in Massachusetts, well educated. Went to Harvard, got kicked out of Harvard, came back into Harvard. He ended up studying medicine. He wanted to be a doctor, but rather than stay in Massachusetts and study in the big Boston schools and such, he goes out west to the frontier. So he's studying under a physician at Fort Snelling, Minnesota. And he figures, little adventure while I'm learning how to be a doctor. Problem is, Fort physician dies, and John Marsh never finishes his education as a physician. But as we'll see later, John Marsh doesn't matter. Lots of stuff happens to him here. He ends up inciting a war, among other things. So he actually had a very close connection with the Sioux Nation. Super good at languages. It's one of the things we learned about John Marsh. Able to facilitate translating a lot of the Native American languages. And there were multiple tribes out there. The Sioux tribe did not get along with the Fox and Fox tribe. Marsh's role for the government was as an Indian agent. So he's supposed to be kind of negotiating with the different tribes, negotiating with the U.S. Army, etc., etc. But if you have a leaning towards one tribe over the others, you might start stuff. And that stuff that he kind of incited actually led to the Black Hawk War. So not good. He gets in trouble. While he's out there, he meets a woman who's half Native, half French Canadian. They have a child, a little boy named Charles. He can't marry her legally because she's got Native blood. But they fall in love, they have a child, little Charles. John Marsh gets in trouble with the army. He actually becomes a wanted man. He figures, you know what, I better leave town for a little while. And where do you go if you're already in the wilderness? You head out west. So he goes down to New Salem, Illinois, which is where he leaves Charles, his young son. Leaves him with a family friend. And he heads out west. He's got some more adventures, which I don't have time to talk about, but he eventually makes it to El Pueblo de la Reina de Los Angeles, out to California, which we now, of course, just call Los Angeles. But it was Mexican territory, the Pueblo down there. He shows up. He's this American showing up in the middle of this Pueblo run by the Mexican authorities. They're a little suspicious. They're like, what do you want? What are you doing here? Marsh, thinking quickly, goes to a saddlebag, pulls out a piece of paper, shows it to the Mexican authorities, and says, I'm a doctor. They're perhaps a little suspicious. Marsh says, look, all this right here, that's my name, John Marsh. All of this stuff right here indicates I am a doctor. They believe him. Now the fact that he was showing them his Harvard certificate written in Latin that they couldn't read didn't seem to matter. He convinced them. And from that point on, he became known as Dr. John Marsh. His whole time in California, he acted as a doctor. So he began healing the sick natives. He began healing the Mexicans in the territory and the Spanish in the territory at that time. And he starts making money. His goal is to make enough money to buy some property, send back for his son Charles to come and he can start his home again. His wife, his wife, who he couldn't marry, ended up passing away in childbirth for his second child. So she's gone. It's just the son Charles. He's starting to make money. He eventually finds some property, but not down in the Los Angeles area. He heads up north, and he finds some land that's got super fertile soil. It's right next to a river with plenty of fresh water. Great hunting grounds. He buys the property, 17,000 acres, for $500. He names it Rancho Las Magañas. Las Magañas, the sand dunes. Because on the shore, next to the river, were sand dunes. He named his property after them. Living on the property already were Bay Miwoks, native to the area. Peaceful tribe because they had all the resources that they needed to live satisfied life. Plenty of food, plenty of shelter, etc. He makes a deal with the natives. You help me build an adobe house. You help me in the wheat fields, in the orchards, and etc. that I'm going to have here, and I will treat your sick and injured. So they're living on his land during this time. Other folks learn about it, including Big Will and Bartleson. So they create one of the first wagon trains coming out west. Big wagon train, and they are targeting John Marsh's adobe house. So they head over the Oregon Trail and they make their own path. They end up in John Marsh's property, his house. He greets them with open arms because he's looking for Americans to settle this land. He tells them, please go ahead and kill one of my cows, feed your group here. Welcome. Problem, they were not frontiersmen, they were not cattlemen, they were actually teachers that led this cattle or this wagon train. So they go out into his ranch and they find the biggest gold cow that they could find, and that's what they slaughter to feed. Turns out that was his prize breeding steer. I think we have cattle folks in here who probably can understand that. That might upset somebody. John Marsh got so upset that the next day he kicked the whole wagon train off his property. Bartleson later writes in his journals, John Marsh was the meanest man I've ever met. And of course, Marsh is just being pragmatic. If you're dumb enough to kill my breeding cow, then you need to go. So things are going well for him. He ends up writing back east for his son Charles. The letter he gets back from the family he was staying with says, so sorry your son Charles has passed away too. We would imagine John Marsh is heartbroken. He now lost his wife. He's lost his young son. He's all alone out here now. What are you going to do? Well, he does what he does, and he continues his rancho and his property, his orchards. He's growing it. And then something happens that changes his life. Gold is discovered not too far away from where his rancho already existed. And now we have, John Marsh had been trying to get people to come out west for years and years. Only a few would come. But when gold is discovered, thousands are coming. John Marsh becomes incredibly wealthy. Not from gold, from feeding the miners. He's already set up with wheat fields, orchards, vineyards, cattle ranch, anything that these folks needed, they could get from John Marsh. He expands his rancho to 40,000 acres. So in this map, 1853, Marsh's house here, it's a little hard to tell just what it covers until we put it over present day. All of Brentwood, all of Oakley, Discovery Bay, half of Antioch was all John Marsh's rancho. From the shoreline of the San Joaquin River to the foothills of Mount Diablo. He built his own wharf. You can still see the remnants of the name, Marsh Landing, near the Antioch Bridge. Huge rancho, very successful. He ends up meeting another woman. So the woman here is Abby Tuck. Abby was a school teacher who lived in San Jose at that time. Turns out, she and a friend just wanted to go exploring. So they go wandering and get lost. And they stumble upon this adobe out in the middle of nowhere. Well, it turns out, Abby meets John. John meets Abby. They have a long engagement of 2 weeks before they marry. I guess when it's right, it's right. When you know, you know. Year later, they have a baby. That's Alice. She's about 2 years old in this photograph, little Alice. So all is going great once again for John Marsh after all this tragedy from his earlier life. About 2 years after this photograph, Abby also dies. We think probably tuberculosis, based on the letters. One of the fascinating things with historical societies, some of them have these actual letters. And so reading through the letters that Abby wrote back to her family back east, and then later John wrote back for her, sounded kind of like tuberculosis because it was a long kind of drawn-out illness. And she was eventually buried on the property there. But she and little Alice are in fact the reason he built that house. Because they were living in this small adobe, not going to be safe for a growing family. What you needed was a 7,000 square foot stone mansion with a 65-foot tall gun tower that could protect. Abby was buried initially under an oak tree on the property out there. We'll see, that's not where she ended up. Soon after her passing, John Marsh gets a knock on his door. Not totally unusual. Strangers, travelers coming from east, know of his property. He opens the door. Stranger says, look, I'm just looking for a place to stay, spend the night, maybe get a little food before moving on. I just came from back east, over the Sierras, etc., etc. Marsh says, sure, no problem, come on in. My name is Dr. John Marsh. And that person says, oh, thank God. My name is Charles Marsh. I'm your son. Turns out, Charles Marsh, as a little boy, did not pass away. That letter somehow mistakenly got to John Marsh, telling him that. So he never continued looking for his son. His son, after becoming an adult, then had to travel out west to find his father. They reunite in this surprising manner. We would imagine John Marsh has got him thrilled. Now he's got an adult to try to teach his business to, etc., etc. Everything's going great at that point. And here's Charles. Until within about 3 months of their reunion, and about 3 months of John Marsh being able to live in that mansion, the mansion he built for Abby, his wife, who never got to live in it. The mansion he built for Alice, his little daughter, who also did not live in it because he didn't want her growing up out there in the wilderness. She ended up being raised by a family in Oakland, family friends in Oakland. But now he had Charles. John Marsh hops in his buggy, horse and buggy, takes it out to Martinez. In Martinez, he's going to jump on a ferry and he's going to take the ferry to San Francisco to conduct some business, selling cattle or something along those lines. He never makes it. In Martinez, John Marsh is confronted by 3 vaqueros. These are Mexican cowboys that he hires to work his rancho. Best cowboys in the world. He hired them to work his rancho. But they accuse him of not paying them what he owed. Marsh, being the super pragmatic businessman, says, you don't do the work you're supposed to, I'm not paying you. That's the way it is. They get into a conflict. One of the vaqueros pulls out his knife, cuts John Marsh's throat, leaves him on the side of the road. This placard here, you can go find today. This is the site of John Marsh's murder in 1856. If you're familiar with Martinez, off Highway 4 is Pacheco Boulevard. Take Pacheco Boulevard as you're heading down toward town, look off on the side of the road, you'll see the site of John Marsh. John Marsh is now currently buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland. And when Charles, his son, had him interred, he figured it was best not to do it on their property in what is present-day Brentwood, on the rancho. Who knows what was going to happen to that? So he actually had Abby and both of them interred in Oakland, and that's where they are now. And some of the other connections, as you follow the history of these folks and their super fascinating story, has to do with Alice. Remember Alice, a little daughter, sent to Oakland to be raised by some family friends there. That's where she grew up. Here she is at about 18 years old. She ended up marrying a man named William Cameron. William Cameron was a businessman, investor, and et cetera, et cetera. One of the things they did was they bought that place. That mansion is sitting on the shore of Lake Merritt. So Lake Merritt used to be surrounded by these Victorian mansions. There's one left. Guess which one? Her house. So she had inherited half of John Marsh's wealth. They purchased this mansion. That's where she lived for a while. They had a couple daughters. One of them did not survive. Another thing that she purchased that I thought was fascinating was some property over the hill from Oakland. So her husband, William, he's an investor. He's trying to buy property, etc., using her money, of course. Buys some land and tells Alice, what do you want to name this property? Alice thinks for a minute. I don't know what to name property. How about I name it after my favorite poet? Well, her favorite poet was a 17th century English woman named Catherine Fowler Phillips. Catherine Fowler Phillips, rare to have a woman writing poetry in England in the 17th century. Her nom de plume was the matchless Orinda. Guess what she named her property? Orinda Village. We now call it the town of Orinda. So Orinda was purchased by Alice using the wealth of John Marsh, and that's why it has its name to this day. What is then left of the John Marsh stone house? 1970, it was almost gone. So there's a whole long story about Marsh's murder, why he was murdered, the real reason he was murdered. His son Charles spending 10 years of his life tracking down his father's murderer. But if you're spending your life tracking down a murderer, who's running the property? Pretty much nobody. And so it falls into disrepair, it gets sold off. 1970, the house is almost falling down. Hence, I went to a fundraiser to try to keep it from falling down. Enough money was raised to keep it from falling down. The inside is still there, pretty gutted, still there. But the other fascinating place about where Marsh and his rancho was, is it's got history not just from 1856. It's got history from 7,000 years of humans living at this site. So much so that the California State Park System has purchased the property and the house, and it is now John Marsh State Historic Park. They don't have enough money to fix the house up either, but at least it's preserved to keep from collapsing. And there's some things in the works to hopefully eventually open the park up to the public. And that's the house today. Still standing. The top looks a little different due to an earthquake that knocked off that gun turret up there. But it's still there. So, fascinating history. I then tried to roll this into a book. John Marsh, California's first doctor, he was in fact the first American to settle in all of Contra Costa County. His stone mansion, reunion with his long-lost son. But in each of my books, there is a mystery. And the mystery with John Marsh that has been around for decades, including when he was alive, was a fabled treasure in gold. Marsh was an extremely wealthy man. Part of the reason his house got so dilapidated was treasure hunters. Would you like to know where John Marsh's gold is? That's good. Well, I can't tell you everything, right? And I'll tell this now, hopefully I'll remember later. I don't just write a biography about John Marsh, though. To tell the story, I have a present-day murder mystery. So as my present-day characters are following clues, their story becomes intertwined with John Marsh. So you learn the real history of Marsh and his murder, where his gold might be, but you do it by following a murder mystery. Present day. Anyway, so that was book one. I thought I was done. I got the book out. I self-publish all my own stuff. I just wanted to get the book out. Problem was, two things. People seemed to like it, and it was a lot of fun to do. That was a problem, because if I was going to do another one, I had to find some other interesting history and a mystery. Well, it turns out in Contra Costa County, in the Shadow of Diablo, you don't have to look far if you know where to look. So there's that book, book two. Same series, present-day characters are the same. The history this time, Death at the Healing Waters, inspired by, well, first of all, we got to find where we're talking about. There's Contra Costa County again, way over here. Far east Contra Costa County, in the little town of Byron. Now, what you would find there, if you were there in the late 1800s, is this. This is the Byron Salt Flats, owned by the Risden Iron Works. Now, why were iron works way out there in East Contra Costa County, in the middle of, like, look, there's nothing here. What are they doing there? How is this a mining operation? Turns out they're mining salt. You need salt, apparently in those days, for the smelting of the iron. So they'd have to mine the salt cheaply, relatively. They take it to their smelting operations in San Francisco, and that's where they make the iron for growing San Francisco, a growing Stockton, a growing Sacramento, all of the gold rush that was going on. So they're manufacturing iron, but they're mining salt out here. That goes on for a while, and eventually transporting it all that way became too expensive. So they shut down the iron works. Now the guy that was running the property at this time was named Lewis Mead. He was a relative of Risden. He's running the property, and he's told, okay, look, you either got to shut it down or figure out what you're going to do with this property. And Lewis Mead noticed something about what was going on out here, because it wasn't just mining salt. When they were out there doing the salt, people were always showing up on the property. Why are all these people always out here? Because there was something other than salt out here. There were mineral hot springs. So all through this area, scattered in just small openings, were mineral hot springs. And folks were coming out there to drink the mineral waters for their healing powers. Late 1800s, it was thought pretty much if you had anything ailing you, you can cure it with the right dose of mineral waters. So they can come out there. Some would soak if they had skin issues, but mostly they were drinking. People showing up for free. Lewis Mead says, oh, time out. It's my property. You really want to use this? You're going to have to pay me. So he builds the first hotel. The first Byron Hot Springs Hotel in 1878. Basically, all he did was he put a roof over all those mining buildings. And then he called it a hotel. And he marketed it as a hotel. Come partake in our healing waters. Stay at our hotel. It's going to cost you a little bit, but you're going to be cured of whatever your problem is. And it worked. Super successful. Here's the Byron Hot Springs, famous A little hard to read here, but let me tell you. There's the white sulfur, the liver and kidney, various hot springs. But here's what it's going to cure. These waters and baths are specific for the cure of rheumatism, gout, sciatica, neuralgia, catarrh, liver and kidney, and bladder troubles, White's disease, blood and skin diseases. In addition, difficulties arising from overeating. Intemperate use of alcoholic drinks can be cured. Also, insomnia, nervous diseases, female complaints, fever. Oh, by the way, there's no poison oak in here. I guess that was important. So, literally, whatever was ailing you, you drink the right dose of mineral springs out here at the hot springs, you're going to get cured. So, super successful. He eventually talked the Southern Pacific Railroad to building a station up there. We got to get these people from all over out here easier, because we're out in the middle of nowhere, literally. So they got a train station out there. Once you got to the train station, you hop on the omnibus and take you right to the resort. So we had the whole setup going. Here's Lewis and his first wife, Blanche, drinking from the White Sulphur Spring. So you can see down behind the rock here would just be a little bubbling hot mineral spring. Dip your cup in, drink the water straight from it, and be cured. Everything was going great until about 1901, when the entire hotel burned to the ground. Hotel burns to the ground. Lewis Mead has to decide what he's going to do. Okay, we're giving up on this nice idea, or are we going to do something else? When it burns down in 1901, he decides we're going to do something else. In 1902, opens the second Byron Hot Springs Hotel. He hires an architect this time. This guy, James Reed. Turns out, he's the guy that designed the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. Hotel Del Coronado in San Diego. Lewis says, design me a nice hotel. I want this to be a luxury property. And he comes up with the second Byron Hot Springs Hotel. If you're familiar at all with Byron, and you think this luxury hotel used to be out there in the middle, it's pretty remarkable. Anybody that was wealthy, famous, would have ended up, if they were on the West Coast, at the Byron Hot Springs Hotel. So it's got a list of celebrities galore coming out here as a retreat. If you were ailing, you pay to come out there. The physician in-house would prescribe the right dose of the different waters. Here's the Byron Hot Springs Hotel, California's most famous resort. Here's Blanche again, drinking. Here's her son there as well. They even found a way to pump warm water from the springs into an indoor swimming pool. So this is an indoor swimming pool heated year-round of mineral water that you could swim in. The mud baths had the pure heat with the mineral hot water that you could soak in. It imported Italian marble in all of these buildings. The first golf course west of the Mississippi. I don't know what kind of golf course it is, because that's pretty rough what they're on right there, but it was a golf course. Can anybody tell what these guys are doing over here? They're baseball players. Because this was the summer baseball training center for the San Francisco Seals professional baseball team. This is where they would hang out as well. Lewis Mead's first wife, Blanche, eventually passed away. He ended up remarrying a somewhat younger woman at this time. And all was good until 1920. 1912, all of that beautiful hotel burned to the ground. So, once again, Lewis Mead has to decide, what am I going to do? Give it up, finally, move on with my life, or rebuild. Hires the same guy, has one caveat. This time, can you design me a hotel that won't burn to the ground? And he does. This is the third Byron Hot Springs hotel. Steel framework inside, brick exterior. This place is not burning to the ground. It opens, they continue with the marketing, becomes extremely successful still until about 1929. Because in 1929, we have the Great Depression. So when the Great Depression hits, a lot of those really wealthy people are not so wealthy anymore. The folks that needed to come there for the heating powers couldn't afford it anymore either. So the hotel after 29, it's still a hotel in the 30s. It's just lost its glamour and its luster. Still marketing. This is what it looked like in its heyday. All of that dry, arid, salt and sand was converted with about 10 feet of topsoil into what literally was an oasis. And they call this the Palm Court because that is what was in front of the hotel at that time. That's the dining room, grand, luxurious, and literally farm to fork dining, because they would bring in foods from the surrounding orchards and vineyards and wheat fields and ranchos and river and have the freshest foods with them. And then Lewis Mead passes away. Lewis Mead passes away. His second wife ends up building a memorial. She builds it over a couple of the hot springs, his two favorite ones, Liver and Kidney Springs. Once again, all imported marble in there. But when 29 hits, it's kind of the last of the resort. But it's not the last of Byron Hot Springs. Because in the 1940s, somebody else gets the hotel. And that happens to be the United States Army. So the Army, in 1943, is looking for a place to bring prisoners of war onto the continental U.S. There were two places in the whole continental U.S. in World War II. One was in Virginia, and one was at Camp Tracy, otherwise known as Byron Hot Springs Hotel. Secretly, undercover, these rooms are blacked out so the prisoners can't see. They fenced around it, but they used it because they kind of gave the prisoners free reign of the property to help them feel comfortable. They would interrogate them. These were mostly German and Japanese naval officers, so they'd interrogate them. But it wasn't a torture center. And they let them go back to their rooms. What the prisoners found out was that the ventilation system between the rooms was changed so they could talk to each other, the prisoners. And the ceilings were dropped down with microphones. Down in the basement, the translators sat and just listened into the conversations. So that was the secret interrogation center at Camp Tracy through World War II. 1945 comes around, they're finished. Oh, but wait, Byron Hot Springs Hotel, they're not finished. Because in 1948, somebody else buys it. Turns out it's the Greek Orthodox Church. Now, if you followed the many lives we've gone through so far, multiple hotels, the famous resort, World War II interrogation center, and now the Greek Orthodox Church owns it. They turned it into their North American Retreat Center. So folks are coming here to spend time. They're running summer camps here in the summer for kids. So super popular place. That lasts until about to the 1950s. Which brings us to today. A lot of folks, when I do the talks, are like, well, what's there now? Well, what's there now is that. This is the shell, basically, of the third hotel. It has been entirely gutted inside. You can see there's no caring for any of the property on the outside. Somehow, the palm trees from that palm court managed to survive. They're still hanging in there, but that's all that's there. You go inside. You can see somebody's been using it, but that's what's left. So take that whole fascinating story. Some of the renowned guests we know were there. Fatty Arbuckle, Buster Keaton, they hung out there. Lefty O'Doul, the famous baseball player, he was there. Wealthy sugar baron Adolph Spreckles, you know Spreckle Sugar, he was there. These rich folks hung out at the Byron Hot Springs Hotel. Who knew? Secret Interrogation Center. And remember, all these stories have a mystery. I haven't talked about the mystery yet. What a 137 carat diamond. That's missing. Would you like to know where that diamond is?
Yeah, it's in the book.
That's book 2. Well, I can't tell you. Give it away right now. All right, moving on. Can there be any more fascinating history in this county? That's book 2. Book 3. What's the black diamond? Inspiration, Contra Costa County. We look at Contra Costa County, follow the red star, that's where we're talking about. The foothills outside of Pittsburgh, Antioch. The inspiration for this one is a cemetery. Because if you learn about what happened and who was in this cemetery, it's really fascinating history. Because most folks in that cemetery lived in the town of Nortonville. Most people have never heard of the town of Nortonville in Contra Costa County. But in the late 1800s, Nortonville was the largest town in the whole county. There's an etching of it. It's a little hard to see in the etching, but there's a little train, small gauge railroad here, a bunch of outbuildings. In the photograph, schoolhouse. Here's Main Street, the back of Main Street. And up here are coal mines. So this was a coal mining town. When I started doing this research, I didn't even know Contra Costa County had coal mining going on. In the late 1800s, they did. And in fact, this is the largest coal mining ever in California. There's the front of Main Street. Not much of a street to it, but if you're on your horse, I guess it was okay. I always like bringing in a little bit of the science of why this town ended up there. Hopefully, most folks know Mount Diablo wasn't always a mountain. Mount Diablo on all those foothills used to be flat underneath a shallow ocean. The whole Central Valley in California used to be underwater. And it was underwater at the right times and temperatures. Some of the plantings died and got squished over millions of years into coal. When the coal was discovered, folks started digging it out and selling it and created the town. It's always fun to kind of look at some of these of how they did it back in the late 1800s. You dig a big hole, you go down the bottom of the hole, you hit the vein, and you start chipping away at the vein. So that gravity would bring your coal down into the cars, and then you hoist it back up. These guys are chipping away at it 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, underground, in the dark, except for the lights on their heads. This was the largest mine, Black Diamond Mines. You can see their operations. They got the steam engines going. Now it's going to hoist the stuff up and down. I love this photo showing you some of the characters. Black Diamond Mine work crew. These are mostly Welsh immigrants, including these two kids, 10 to 12-year-olds that they called knobbers. And they were also underground with the miners. Because anybody see how wide that thickest mine, the coal vein was? 40 inches. That was the biggest one. So the men were on their knees or stomachs picking away. But you needed somebody that can move up and down easily to scoop the coal back down into the cars. Well, who's going to do that? Either somebody short or 10-year-old kids. So you have a couple knobbers in the mines with you, and they're moving up and down that vein of coal that's this high, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, underground, in the dark, except the lights of your blankets. But it was a big town. That's the school. Most famous resident, woman on the right, Sarah Norton. She's the widow of Noah Norton, who founded the town. Noah died just a couple years after founding the town, but Sarah lived for a long time after that. She was a midwife, and there's written some articles describing her as giving birth to upwards of 400 children in the surrounding area and not losing a single one in the remarkable feat in the late 1800s. Sarah Norton died tragically. And she died tragically on her way to a medical appointment in Clayton. So she took her horse and buggy from Nortonville over the hill toward Clayton, and it was a terrible accident that killed her. You can find her tomb at that cemetery. One of the things that was fun to do in researching this one was learning about the Welsh culture. Turns out Welsh are big into singing. I didn't know that. They're super big into their choir. So they were back in the 1800s, and they still are. And here is one of the most fascinating connections in all of the books and all the research. Because I'm researching some of these people that are buried in the cemetery presently. One of them, William Gething, died in 1876. Find out he died in a mine explosion, killed a bunch of miners. Super dangerous work at that time. But I was curious about the symbols on his tombstone. This one I sort of recognize. This is the Oddfellows, fraternal order. This one I did not recognize. This is a shield, a helmet, and crossed battle axes. And on some of the other tombstones, there's an F, C, and B. Well, it turns out, it's really interesting connections. Because that's logo looks like this, FCB. The FCB stands for Friendship, Charity, and Benevolence. This is the logo of a secret fraternal order called the Knights of Pythias. The Knights of Pythias, you ever heard of them? Who are they? What are they doing in Nortonville in the late 1800s? And engraved on this guy's tombstone. Well, the Knights of Pythias was a fraternal order created during the Civil War. Civil War, break in the United States. Somebody said, you know what, we got to resolve this. What if I create a fraternal order based on friendship, charity, benevolence to help bring the country together? That fraternal order spreads, and it ends up in Nortonville with these wealthy coal miners. Who's Pythias? What do his knights have to do with the Civil War? Knights of Pythias was inspired by a play called Damon and Pythias. I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but basically, this is an ancient Greek play about two friends who demonstrate sharing their philosophy of friendship, charity, and benevolence. So that's what the play is about. That's what inspired the creation of Knights of Pythias. Where did this play come from? It turns out the play represents the philosophy of what some people call the very first philosopher ever. thinking, first philosopher. Probably not the person you think of. You've heard of Pythagoras, but if you're like me, you heard of Pythagoras in one way and one way only. Because he's got a theorem. Pythagorean theorem that we learned in algebra. A squared plus b squared equals c. That's all I knew. Math guy, right? A whole lot more to Pythagoras. He was a philosopher. He taught, etc., etc. One of the things he taught was live by friendship, charity, benevolence. That inspired the creation of a play, Damon and Pythias. That inspired the development of the Knights of Pythias fraternal order. That created this fraternal order that was in Nortonville in the late 1800s with William Gifford. That's the cemetery that inspired it all. What of it today? It is part of Black Diamond Mines Regional Preserve. So part of the East Bay Regional Park System. You can go and visit it. You can go underground. Most of their underground that you can go visit are actually sand mines, because after the coal mining shut down, they mined sand there. And they have an almost mile-long underground tour that you can take. And you can still walk the trail to the cemetery, nowadays called Rose Hill Cemetery. And if you know where to look, you're going to find a tombstone, and it's going to have a little symbol of a shield, a helmet, and crossed battle axes on it. And you're going to say, I know what that means. Put it all together into book 3, Welsh Immigrants, Secret Society. Oh, I forgot to mention the White Witch. Anybody familiar with the White Witch? I know a couple people. If you know anybody that was raised or grew up in the Pittsburgh, Antioch area, they will tell you they know of the White Witch at Black Diamond Mines. There's a cemetery there, of course. Now, if you read my book, you might find out the real reason people see the White Witch there. And that's not even the mystery. How about a legendary medieval sword? And guess what? Would you like to know where it is?
Oh boy.
Book 3. Book 3 goes for Black Diamond. Okay, we're almost done. Gets to book 4. Can't be any more fascinating history, right? It just keeps showing up. I think I'm done. and then my research, I find this little tidbit, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a super interesting story. Beneath the tangled vines, let's find out where we're talking about in Contra Costa County. How about the city of Richmond? So far out west Contra Costa. And inspired by a castle.
Oh.
Now, if you were like me, you would be thinking, there can't possibly be a castle in the city of Richmond that I don't know about. Especially me, because I grew up in Richmond. How could I not know of a castle? And if so, why was it there? How did it end up there? And to understand a little bit of that story, we start with a map of Contra Costa County in 1904. This is mostly hand-drawn. It's a little hard to read. That green star is the peak of Mount Diablo. So San Ramon, here we are down here. It even says San Ramon down here. But all of those red ovals, I know you probably can't read them. They're all vineyards and wineries. And we know that wasn't all of them in 1904. That's just the ones that made it on this map. But in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Contra Costa County was filled with vineyards and wineries. I was trying to then find historical images of some of these wineries because I thought that would be fascinating. Well, if you can't find those, you got to find the next best thing, something that looks like it. So if you imagine the old hillsides of Tuscany, Italy, with these sprawling vineyards and these old wineries. It would look something like that, particularly if you lived in Clayton Valley, because that's Clayton Valley. Well, French countryside, ancient vines with the old horse and buggy and the grapes. Kind of similar to what Contra Costa County might have looked like. Oh, wait a minute. That is what it looked like. That's Ignatia. Rolling hills. Acres and acres of vineyards through these hills. Looks a lot like the Spanish countryside and wine growing region. However, that's Alhambra Valley and Martinez. That's what it used to look like. Sprawling, rolling. Probably caught on by now. Anybody recognize the city? You'd be doing pretty good if you did recognize the city, because that's Pleasant Hill. Pleasant Hill looks a little different today. And how about the huge Christian Brothers? Christian Brothers, which some folks of a certain age are familiar with, Christian Brothers wines, began their winery in Martinez. And this property, 2,300 acres of vineyards and orchards, this fabulous Italianate mansion in the middle of it. Everybody recognize it? You also recognize this place, because that's the John Muir home in Martinez. It just looks a little different than Martinez right now, considering right behind here is Highway 4. But that's what it used to look like back in those days. So this whole huge wine industry, not just our county, but the whole state, ended up being run by something called the California Wine Association. This guy, Percy Morgan, was head of the California Wine Association. And if you were any of those growers that I showed here, or any of the other ones, you had to do business with Percy Morgan and the California Wine Association, where you weren't going to sell your wine, you weren't going to sell your business. It's best described probably as a cartel, because you were forced to do business with them. At their peak in the early 1900s, 80% of the entire California wine industry went through the California Wine Association. And here was something else I had no idea about for the wine industry in California. Downtown San Francisco had 27 huge wine warehouses in the late 1800s, early 1900s. These buildings in downtown San Francisco, this is Folsom and 2nd Street, was all storing wine for later transport throughout. This one, the Lockman Warehouse, Brandon Street, San Francisco, huge, ornate, beautiful buildings, and they're all storing wine for shipment out later. If you're of a certain age, you're familiar with Italian Swiss colony wine. Huge wine warehouse down near the wharf in San Francisco. 27 of these things strewn throughout downtown San Francisco. That's what was there. No idea. Until, thank you. Because in 1906, we had an earthquake, little earthquake, big fire. And that fire destroyed nearly all of those wine warehouses. It destroyed millions and millions of gallons of wine. The Wine Association lost millions and millions of dollars during that. They then had to decide, are we done with this business in California? Or do we rebuild? California Wine Association says, there's a lot of money in wine. We're going to rebuild. We're not going to rebuild in San Francisco. So what do? They look across the bay, and what they see is Point Mulati in Richmond, California, right on the shore. And they decide, rather than all of these separate warehouses, we're going to do this all under one roof.
Oh, wow.
And they build the Winehaven Castle, reminiscent of the castles on the Rhone in Europe. Opens in 1908, but it's not just that building. It's an entire small city. Remember, they consolidated all of those multiple warehouses. They basically run all of those major wineries in the state. All of those grapes throughout California are coming here to be processed. They're being barreled, they're being stored, they're being sent out on the train that runs behind here, and the quarter-mile long wharf that they built into San Pablo Bay, shipped out all over the world. This becomes the largest winery in the entire world. So when you grow up in Richmond, and you learn that for some reason, somehow, you never knew the largest winery in the whole world used to be in your backyard, and you think, how did I not know this? It was a small city, Winehaven. Oops. That lasted until a big turn of events in the U.S. Prohibition. So in 1920, Prohibition is passed, and now it's not legal to drink anymore. Winehaven decides to try for a while to produce grape juice. It just didn't sell quite as well as wine. So they eventually have to shut down. What is left of any of this wine industry in California, Contra Costa County, Winehaven? Remember all these ancient, or these vineyards that were all over the county. Anybody know where there are any still? In Contra Costa County? You just have to go to Martinez. It's a winery called Viano, and they still have some existing over 100-year-old vines, ancient vines. You can go to Antioch. The Bedrock Wine Company has purchased land to preserve ancient vines that are still growing there. And you can go to Oakley. And Oakley has property that's been owned for a few decades by Klein Cellars. And you may be familiar with Klein Cellars because they have a big winery operation in Sonoma. If you do wine tasting up in Sonoma, you head up there, pretty much the first winery you hit is Klein Cellars. But their original location where they started was here in Oakley. So my long lectures, I get to talk about the fascinating reason why these things are still here after all this time. What about the buildings? Well, they all burned to the ground, right? Italian Swiss colony burned to the ground. Or did it? Most of them burned to the ground. Italian Swiss colony survived because they had a secret underground spring. And they convinced the Army Corps of Engineers, who was blowing up buildings to keep the fire from blowing up their building, because they said, we have our own water. We're going to use our own water, we're going to save our building. You don't have to blow up our building. And they survived. You can go see their building right now. What of the Winehaven Castle? Well, certainly if there was a castle in Richmond, we would all know it. Well, you just have to know where to look, because it is still there. Winehaven Castle is still there. These were all homes for workers. Later, they were turned into officer housing during World War II because Winehaven became a fueling depot for the Pacific Fleet. They then gave it up, and then it wasn't used for pretty much anything. City of Richmond tried for decades to come to an agreement to what to do with this property. If you can kind of imagine where this is, if you know the San Rafael Bridge, so from this side, right before you go over the San Rafael Bridge, you take the exit, Point Melody is on the shoreline, you keep going, Winehaven is down in that area. Imagine the view you have. You're looking at San Pablo, San Francisco Bay, the San Francisco skyline, stunning property, and the city of Richmond has not been able to figure out what to do with it. And then about 6 months ago, it was finalized as a purchase by East Bay Regional Parks. So it's going to be preserved as another one of the historical properties. They don't have the money to fix it up either, but at least it's going to remain as a historical place. Put it all together in a book. We start with the earthquake, the world's largest winery. In doing this research, one of the things that tied a lot of the things together was a certain group of people, Chinese immigrants. Because during this time, they had finished building the railroads, they had finished building all the levee system that's keeping us dry, keeping a lot of the state dry, and now they were working orchards and vineyards. So a lot of the vineyard workers in the county at that time were Chinese immigrants. And everybody knows where the secret underground tunnels are, right? No? Would you like to know? Yes. How about a cryptic message in a mysterious bone box? If you're not sure what a bone box is, guess what you have to do? Well, I mean, you could just Google it, but it's more fun to read. And a fortune in missing wine and...
That's missing.
It's missing. Would you like to know where millions of dollars of wine is right now? Thank you. Book 4. So, that's all of it put together in book 4. There are some themes that run through all the books, where past meets present. So the past is based on real people, places, and events, and then it intertwined with present-day murder mystery, like I mentioned. Fact meets fiction. We talked about the fact. The present-day murder mystery, that's fiction, I made that. And mystery meets romance, so mystery, you got a touch of that in all of them, meets romance. So my present-day characters are 2 high school teachers. Did I mention I was a high school teacher? 2 high school teachers that are they're following clues to solve murders. Well, if you do that for 4 books in a row, a little romance might start building. And there's the 4 books I always have to mention, give credit where credit is due. First of all, this is my website. You can buy books there. I have an interactive map that's associated with each of the books, so you can actually link yourself to the real stuff. My editor-in-chief and also my chief financial officer happens to be my wife. My cover designs are all done by my daughter. My audio narration, if you prefer audiobooks, that's my wife's sister. You can get them on Amazon. You can, if you like ebooks, you can do Kindle. If you like listening, you do Audible. My sister-in-law does them. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, I do the full-length version of each one of these for Los Medanos College. So if you really want to get into the depths of the history and some of the connections I didn't have time to touch on. In March, I'll be doing it on Zoom, so anybody can listen in to them. And with that, I will be here for a little while, and so if anybody does want to buy, I have a few books. If you want to buy some signed copies, you're welcome to do that. Krishna, I'll turn it back over to you.